So let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope everyone is doing reasonably well, given all the crazy things happening in the world. We know life is complicated, so we really appreciate your spending a few minutes with us today. My daughters are 2 floors below me, watching Moana in the basement, so hopefully I've got about 30 minutes without interruption. I have seen Moana 14,000 times this week. Now, let's get started here. I'm Isaac Brown with Landmark Ventures. I'll be moderating our debate today. The main panel is going to be 15 minutes long, and then we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. You could submit questions to the Q&A throughout the whole conversation. If we don't get to your question during the Q&A session, feel free to email it to me. I can share it with the panelists as a follow-up. Today we're going to have a dynamic debate between a couple of friends of mine about a topic that's near and dear to me. For years now, investors have poured billions of dollars into industrial tech startups, but industrial enterprises are extremely slow to buy and roll these out at scale. So the question is, why is there so much misalignment between these VC investments and enterprise buying in the space? So to get to the heart of the matter, we've got both sides of the table here to discuss a debate. And with that, I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists. We've got Bilal, who's a partner at Lux Capital, and Abel, who is Chief Information Officer at Bayer Pharma. I like the dynamic here because these guys are on opposite sides of the issue, Abel being a buyer and Bilal being an investor. And in fact, there's actually one company that Bilal invested in that Abel bought and is rolling out. So these guys have some unique chemistry. But let's get started with a couple of quick intros and then we'll jump into the debate. So Bilal, you want to go first? Can you just quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. Glad to be here. Good to see everyone, at least those that I can see in person on the video here. My name is Bilal here. I'm a partner at a fund called Lux Capital. We manage about $2.5 billion, investing primarily what I call deep tech startups. So these are companies where they're solving deeply technically complex problems targeted towards industrial products, healthcare companies, life sciences companies, and so on. One way we think about this could also be that, industries that tend to be more regulated, more geographically diverse, international, complex sales cycles, but also complex operations. I'm an early stage investor and on the boards of a dozen or so companies right now.
Great. Thanks, Bilal. Abel, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, why not? Abel Archundia. I look after Bayer Pharma IT as a CIO. So my job is to look after the needs of the pharmaceutical division, which are quite differentiated from the rest of the divisions of the group. However, we share common features, and in some areas we even share the same assets, like, for example, the service centers or some of our manufacturing facilities. We also share so-called digital foundation topics. And in those, I would characterize many of the deep tech topics that Bilal and his colleagues invest in. By background, I am an engineer, but I have a career in consulting as a high technology general manager for a big company. And I've been a CIO for the last 15 years, mostly in the pharmaceutical space.
Excellent. Thanks, guys. Well, let's get started here with the big picture question, which you and I have both spoken about offline multiple times. But what is preventing digital industrial tech startups from scaling? So who wants to go first?
Yeah, it's the heart of the matter. Why don't you take it first, Bilal, and then I comment?
I mean, look, when we invest in these companies, it's clear. A couple of things. Let's be clear. Number one. We are talking about vast swaths of our economy, right? We're not just talking about IT budgets that might be sitting inside smaller corporations. When you think about that, you clear to say that whether you call it digital transformation or a creation of a modern enterprise, there's going to be demand for software, especially, but hardware software solutions that meet the needs of the future. And when that is the case, VCs will continue to invest. The biggest risk that we take on when we invest in these companies often, and it's written down in our memos, is the time to market risk. Are we timing the market right, or are we a little too early? Because if we're a little too early, we might as well not be there. Especially so because in some of these areas, being a little too early could mean being a few years too early. So the biggest problem in these industries has been predicting when the industry is going to be ready to buy at scale, it tends to be, these tend to be somewhat more conservative buyers, though there's always, experienced entrepreneurs always know who are the buyers that tend to be more tech forward and use them as early case studies to convince others. But when the industry starts moving, it actually moves pretty quickly. So the question is, how do you get that wave rolling? The most important role that gets played in all of this, outside of external circumstances that might demand particular needs of products, is key people who play the industry vanguard and the industry sort of thought leader role in being early and seeing the problems that their industries will face, putting their neck out there and solving some of those problems and using solutions from the outside that seem to be at the cutting edge. And sort of leading the rest of the group towards it. And we see that often enough, but obviously we'd like to see that more often. And our entrepreneurs and founders would say, more transparency around the processes and internal decision-making would help.
I think that just coloring that comment a bit, there's kind of 3 stages of a buy process from an inside perspective. Right? First is you have to come to terms with the technology and how it can create business advantage for you. So the entrepreneur, and in many cases, the venture capitalists like both of you, play an evangelization role. You educate us. You tell us why this technology or technologies matter and how they can be applied to this industry as opposed to others. And then I would say many of the large corporations have some degree of tech radar that is looking at technologies that are 2 to 5 years out. And then when they look to be one or 2 years out, then we typically convert those into pilots. That's kind of a second stage in which we do proof of concepts or pilots. Generally, the venture capitalist is no longer involved. And it seems to be that the companies that are gathering momentum and have the staying power to go through the evangelization phase, then those are the companies that you call. Now, typically, these are not very established players. These are companies that you find in industry events, generally sponsored by venture capitalists to help us understand their portfolio companies. And then we jump in and understand what is the mapping between the unmet need, technological or business, and the small company that is in front of them. That second stage to proof of concept usually takes anywhere from 6 to 12 months. And there's one thing that it would be wise to keep in mind. The stakeholder mapping inside of a company is very complex. It's multidimensional, it's geographic, it cuts across functions, and it involves dozens of individuals. These are companies that have a powerful business model that has been established for years. So most of us have a well-redefined functional role. And when we need to build a coalition of support across multiple functions, we also in turn have to educate them about the technology advantage and the business advantage that this can represent. Those 2 things take time. And if you think about an emerging technology that is 2 years out, it's probably not as high priority as the fire I have in the deck from last Saturday. So then I typically find my agenda, there's maybe 4 to 6 hours a week that I spend against topics that are 2 to 5 years out. So it is not the majority of my time. And then of that time, 2/3 are building an internal coalition of support. That takes a lot of meetings, a lot of phone calls, a lot of things. And this exhausts the small companies. So many of them just don't have the resources to cover as many meetings or to stay with them for as long. And I find that I have to take a few, maybe 5 to 10 companies that we mentor through this process. So Bayer has been quite effective through a process we call Grants for Apps, G4A, where we identify promising portfolio companies that get assigned an internal mentor. And this executive sponsor sees the small company through these months of education to the point where we get to scale. And this is an entirely different animal. Getting to scale, and for many of the people on the phone call, I'm sure this is no secret, has to be timed very much to fit the budget cycle of a large company like this. So you want to be in the budget cycle, say, for example, June, July, so that you make it to the September first cut as a business initiative. And at this point, the small company per se is not the factor that makes a difference. Is the internal stakeholder that is willing to champion the business proposition. which happens to involve Lux Capital or your portfolio company, and that takes a few more weeks. And you're entirely right that there at some point, one of the questions we ask is, well, who else has tested this? And that if we find that some of the peer companies, multinational companies, have tested that technology, have adopted it, then it goes like wildfire. This means investors in the space have to have a long-term commitment to the technology. And my question back to you, Bilal, is how do you pick winners in terms of the entrepreneurship team that brings your technology? Because the technology cycles are in many cases faster than my buy cycle. And I tend to see the successful entrepreneur ride one or two technology cycles as we get ready to embark on a business venture that requires that.
Yeah, great question. I think you actually raise a very important issue here as well. You know, talked about the buy cycles and the decision-making cycles at the enterprise level. I think it's important to put that in the context also of the investment cycles in startups, right? So you have, you know, a typical company would raise money to last 18 to 24 months. During that time period, they would need to have, and you know, when they're raising money, they need to show these are the logos that we're engaged with, whether we're at the POC level or otherwise. And then in the process of that round of financing that they have done, whether, you know, they've raised a Series A or B or whatever, they have to convert those to customers to go to the next set of investors or the next round of investors and show that, look, we showed you we had an early engagement. It has transitioned into customers that are paying customers, and perhaps some customers have gone from, you know, the land and expand sort of strategy that these are, you know, you can start talking about a TAM, not just a utility of the product. Sometimes that there's a misalignment there, right? So customers that were at POC stage and when the company was raising the first round of financing are still in the POC stage when they're raising the second round of financing, and now you have a real credibility problem of, you know, what will the transaction of this business really look like? And I think a few different things here on how we address those sort of problems. One is, you know, VCs that tend to invest in these areas tend to have close relationships with CIOs, CISOs, chief data officers, or digital transformation officers to sort of understand what is on your plate in the 1 to 2 year horizon versus 3 to 5 year horizon. We are investing, you know, always out of 10-year funds, looking, you know, startups in our sectors don't exit in 2 to 5 years. These are 5, 7, 8 year investments. These are long-term bets, but it's important to understand how we ramp the burn on our side, you know, how fast you build out the sales team, which could be globally spread, addressing multiple customers, perhaps across multiple sectors, right? Pharmaceutical customers could be one big sector, but it could be manufacturing sector or automotive sector. And, you know, that can start to get pretty expensive pretty quickly. And if you embark on that too early, you could be burning through your fuel, which is always limited in a startup anyways. So having those signals is really important. Now, sometimes you have founders and executives in these companies that have, you know, that have sort of sharpened their skills by being in those industries long enough to understand these signals better and to be able to decipher them better. In other cases, you have VCs that have invested in these spaces long enough that they have a good sense and a good network to be able to ascertain what this looks like. For companies that we invest in, look, it could be a cybersecurity company like Nozomi, or an edge virtualization company like Zeta, or an explainability AI company like Fiddler. These are like horizontal companies. We know that these guys, as you call, they will have to go through 2-3 different technology cycles before they reach full success, which means we ask for teams, and when we do the diligence, it is teams that are not only deeply technical and understand the space that they're going into, but they have the ability to reinvent themselves 2-3 times over. Even if you look at the most well-known companies in our spaces that are now, you know, very large companies, the founders have had to reinvent themselves a few times along the way, often 4 to 5 times by the time they get to $1 billion plus valuation. It's very infrequent you have one trick pony that takes you all the way. So that is a core part of diligence. And I think, you know, a part of what happens, you know, people who are on this call and otherwise, these communities tend to talk to each other a lot, to learn from each other, to share information back and forth. And the resourceful people are able to extract that information faster. So they're able to tell that, hey, this thing is starting to get fast-tracked at pharmaceutical companies because of X, Y, and Z factors. Let's go figure out how do we exploit that to our advantage, versus, hey, this is a good customer, but it might take us a little while. So let's make sure we're rolling at the speed at which our customer is rolling and not burning our fuel too fast.
If I may jump in, I think that you bring up a very good point. I think that the nature of the investments into these companies are not really adversarial. It's not like that that the company comes to sell something, especially for early stage technology companies. We typically see ourselves really working together with a venture capitalist to really accompany the small company up that ramp. I think that the most successful examples I have in the last maybe 2 to 3 years are companies that were identified very early on with a committed investor and a committed anchor client like ourselves. This assures that the company is going to have that critical first project, followed up with 2 or 3 projects that will bring it up to scale. And typically what I see is working well, and I know that both of you guys have done this, not with Bayer, but Bayer has done it actively, is convertible notes that allow us to take a project commitment in a small company that can then be converted into equity as we share things. I think it just stands to reason, right? I mean, you guys have a much broader radar and an input into the deal flow. You see which entrepreneur is doing what. We have a view of the portfolio of projects that is coming up, and we take the risk of project value and return on the investment. You take the risk of the company actually being able to do what as promised or deliver as promised. Maybe in the last couple of minutes, why don't we talk about, Bilal, that specific example in industrial goods that we did together, which it's a 3-year journey, and that must be exhausting for an entrepreneur. So maybe I go first there. I think that first, this is an industrial technology. The priority is very high, but it's somewhat nebulous for the majority of my executive counterparts. Cybersecurity is something at the edge which appears avoidable until you have a catastrophe. We've had a couple of catastrophes in the last few years that provided a lot of education. So that box was ticked. But then we have the issue of setting the priorities for this remote or decentralized sites in coordination with a centralized platform support, which you bring to the table. And then there's that decentralized action depends on life cycle management of assets that are controlled by someone at a plant level, somewhere in Indonesia or in Mexico or in Canada, and we cannot set priorities effectively for them from Berlin. So this is a really complicated landscape of execution, which I think has held us back in the past, and this it explains the 2 or 3 year life cycle, sales cycle that we have in this.
Yeah, we have a thesis internally at Lux that there is a complex stack that got developed for IT. A similar one is getting developed for the OT side as well. So from the underlying infrastructure technologies to obviously cloud enablement, and as these enterprises themselves become very data-centric enterprises and very interconnected and networked enterprises, you start to think about edge computing and edge devices, not only on bringing more data available to you, but also doing real-time inferences. So we've been thinking about this stack from a bottoms up. We've invested in the underlying infrastructure at the edge virtualization stage. The same idea: how do you manage 20,000 or 200,000 nodes when you're sitting in a headquarters, whether in Chile or in Germany, to cybersecurity issues when you're opening up this sort of a attack surface potential. And then you start to see business processes changing. So in certain verticals, we're starting to see real dramatic changes, not just in engineering and management of assets, but also in how sales and marketing and recruiting and associated finance operations are changing because of the data that's coming from the field. So we've invested in a bunch of these technology areas. In all of these cases, I think you're absolutely right. These journeys we understand with these core clients, the anchor clients, is going to take long. So we engage with them early. In 5 to 10 years ago, strategics used to get involved as potential investors in these companies, at a very late stage. It's almost like the business unit would make the purchasing decision, and then maybe you would have a conversation about some kind of a strategic partnership. So hence, you were already at the end of the 2-3 year journey you talked about. We're starting to see that change, where, strategic individuals, whether these are strategic venture capital firms, it doesn't really matter, but strategic corporate leaders are engaging with these startups at an early stage and potentially starting to take stakes in these companies to be at the table to understand not only what this particular company is doing, but what's happening in that space. So as you talked about your 2 to 5 year plan, so you have more information coming in. And on the other side, we are hearing, for example, over the last 2 years, we've been hearing a lot about this OT-IT convergence, where the decisions that used to be seen as OT-only decisions are now, look, these are really important, critical infrastructure, but also enterprise-level decisions. They have to go through the CIO. And, and this is a good thing, right? It not only means that the budget is larger, but it also means that it's a more coordinated campaign that can be rallied now around, infusing this technology into the enterprises. So as we talked in the beginning, the relationship between the buyer and the seller is no longer just a transactional one. I think people understand that this is a more strategic one. In many of these cases, these early anchor clients help us develop the product. So they are, they're sort of real development partners rather than just early buyers. And VCs, as I said, have a long-term horizon. So I don't think that is ever a concern. I think the bigger issue has always been a lack of information, either because the customer, that particular customer set may be more opaque, or the relationships don't exist that allow that information to flow freely. And in some ways, the organizations like Landmark, what they provide is sort of the conduit for that information to flow back and forth. There's a lot of people on this call who are either CEOs or CIOs or CISOs, and it hasn't been easy in the past for all kinds of people to be able to engage with that audience. And I think the more of that needs to happen, especially as what I call OT enterprises start to see that they have to move at technology speed, right? Like if you deploy cybersecurity solutions, you will start seeing upgrades very fast. I mean, all CIOs know that. And you will have to figure out how to engage with the broader tech community in an earlier stage, but also in a very iterative stage.
Okay, guys.
Thought there is that we should forget that there's also an item as to whether the counterparts in the business functions or in the sites get the technology and what it can do for them. So we are in all of this, we're assuming that there's a capability on the part of the organization to really adopt and use the technology and make money with it, which is not always assured. I think that fits in the asymmetry of information that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Isaac, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. We gotta try and stick to our schedule a little bit here. That was a great dialogue, guys. I want to use our last 7 minutes for Q&A. We have a bunch of questions already. We could probably get to 2 or 3 of them. So anybody else who wants to share one, please do. The one I like the best actually is for you, Abel. And I want to put this under the context of you as an IT leader now having kind of people reporting into you who are part of operations, right? Under the purview of your tech leadership. Now, do you enable employees further down the org chart to find tools that work for them, or do you focus more on mandating specific tools to ensure consistency across the organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's some areas where you make money by having standards that allow you to be more efficient. There's other areas, and I think OT is one of them, where we don't have standards that we can really refer. And if you pick a standard that is driven by a vendor, then you're looking yourself into an area that may not be the most innovative. So the engineering and technology colleagues that are now more part of the IT team, as we see this convergence between IT and OT, they need to be enabled to bring innovation to the table. And I think that fits in the proof of concept space. We have enough plants, a company like ours has enough plants around the world. You can always find a packaging line where you can test this or that. But all of this has to be a shared investment with the capitalist, in this case, you guys, the small company which has the technology and we're going to co-develop, and ourselves. We have to split the risk of this innovation when we're going to test it. And I absolutely expect, and this is something that used to be the thinking, let's try to outsource as much as possible the break and fix, including at plants. Well, most of these break and fix specialists that we have in many of the sites are the most innovative people we have. And they're really with their ears close to the ground, finding out what technology is needed and matching the business opportunity with a technology that can solve that issue. It's not easy though. They have an uphill battle to convert something which is an innovation in Brazil into something which is a corporate standard in a major global corporation. My role is to be a jungle guide, both internally to these entrepreneurs, as well as externally to entrepreneurs that bring technology into the company.
Okay, interesting. And so then I think we have time for one more that I think you can both answer in a different way, and I like this question. So, and it relates to something you both said. So, Bilal, earlier in this discussion, you mentioned that selling into industrial operations was a little bit different than selling to IT. I also think it's different than selling to marketing. It's just a different sale. It's also a different investment. And then Bilal, you said that a big issue with these kinds of sales cycles was stakeholder alignment, right? Because there's so many different functions that have to come into play to buy and roll one of these out. So I guess I'm going to reframe the question and say, how is investing in or buying digital industrial technologies different than buying traditional IT or marketing or finance technologies? What are the obstacles that startups are likely to encounter, and what advice would you have for them to navigate these sales cycles? So Abel, you took the last one. Bilal, do you want to take that from an investor perspective, and then maybe we can close it out with your thoughts, Abel?
I think a couple of quick thoughts, obviously in limited time here. One is some of these are critical technologies, so they have significant impact on, how the infrastructure actually works or the work processes actually function. So the timeline, even to operationalize, even if the POCs goes well, is actually usually far longer. It's not something like it's not a new chat channel that you can start using and, hey, we didn't like it, so across the, no, you're changing out your firewalls, you're changing up, boxes are going out into the field and getting deployed and authenticated and so on and so forth. So you have to understand that well. This refers to, I think something that we were talking about a little bit earlier, and Abel was just, was just talking about it. When we see companies that have to do enterprise level sale, so high ACV numbers that, are going to take the 6 to 24 months to sell, having one single contract is not going to be the most important thing, or having one single ACV number is not the important thing. It's the repeatability of that and the ability of that. Are you seeing that repeat signal that this can work? Because the cost to scale up that enterprise sales force is extremely expensive to a startup. Compare that to in typical digital technology, especially those that might be your own, let's do a sign up and start using. These are smaller ACV accounts, more organic growth, less cost to scaling across multiple industries. So VCs look at that differently in the sense that, I can still see scale without deploying a lot of capital behind it. Two different ways of selling and two different ways of capitalizing or the capital needs. And VCs pay a lot of attention to not only where's my money going to go and what signals I'm going to get, but more importantly, will it give me the repeatable signal I need that, the more I give $1 to it, the more $0.05 I get back.
I think a complementary answer would be that the CEO of a startup has to really be a coalition builder. I think that it used to be that I see it's different from normal IT or digital technologies, where you can do this in a garage or with a few inventive colleagues in a small office. I think that the OT play is an ecosystem play, where you have to have a willing partner in a plan where you can actually prove your concept. You have to have an investor, an angel plus pathway into Series A or B that can allow you to get to a minimal viable product. And you have to have a team in your startup that can really be flexible and be willing to architect their solution to get to that first big project. And that coalition building doesn't come that naturally to many of the CEOs that have, they're on a mission, right? So I see the most successful entrepreneurs that I work with as people that are able to help me build a coalition internally with the stakeholders, as well as externally that brings the talent, the technology, the funding, and the projects to get this to scale. I see my responsibility as being able to help on the inside, build that coalition of support, assure that there's a pipeline of projects or rollouts as we've done together here, and over time, be willing to see some of these companies get acquired, and yet the technology concept will continue, because the sales cycle into OT, as you said, is 7 to 10 years. It's proportional to the life cycle of the assets we're managing on site.
Okay. Well, that's all our time today. So thank you guys. It was great to have you both on here today. To anybody else who's watching out there, if you have an additional question that you want me to pitch to Abel or Bilal, or you'd like to connect with them, just shoot me an email or give me a call, and we'd love to continue the dialogue. Thanks everyone so much, and stay safe and sane.